Hello, I'm Lynn Alden of Lynn Alden Investment Strategy, a firm that focuses on providing market research for institutional and retail investors about a variety of different asset classes, including digital assets. And today I'm going to talk about the misconception that Bitcoin is easy to displace. That basically the probability that another blockchain could come along and be superior to Bitcoin in most or all metrics. And so let's dive right in. So if we take a step back, basically, when we talk about the success of cryptocurrency, it's reliant in very many ways on the network effect, which is also how protocols and social media platforms and a variety of other things derive their value. And so when it comes to blockchains, the stronger the network effect, the better the security and development enjoys, resulting in an entrenched advantage that gives it an almost insurmountable gap compared to competition. And so when we look at the history of Bitcoin, it's gone through basically four cycles of growth. And so far, those have correlated. People can debate how causation plays here, but they've been rather correlated to Bitcoin's halving cycle. And so every 4 years, Bitcoin is pre-programmed to change the number of new coins that are generated every 10 minutes. And so during the course of its almost 13-year history, it's gone through this period where every 4 years is a smaller number of coins generated. But when that happens, when that kind of that difficulty, that new coin generation kicks in, that generally results in basically a supply shock, you could say. Basically, the market had already settled on a certain supply demand balance. And when that new supply gets cut in half, that has historically led to, or at least been correlated with, a price increase. And that has often resulted in periodic bubbles that capture media attention. Then there's a correction. Bitcoin most like frequently has been labeled dead, but then it recovers and continues on going forward. And so it's been rather volatile. But when we zoom out and look at this logarithmic view of the price, it's actually been the steady state of increases. And of course, the big question is how long will this continue? Will this reach a certain plateau of multi-trillion-dollar asset and go up from there? Or will this eventually roll over and be surpassed by either some other technology, or will the whole space just no longer be effective? And most signs point to that the network effect continues to be extremely strong, and we're going to walk through some of the steps here. And so overall, Bitcoin's irreplaceable attributes largely rest on three different categories. So there's security, scale, and decentralization. And so they all play into each other as well. So security can help increase its scale can help increase its security. But basically, when we analyze the qualities of the network, we can go through these three areas. And so, for example, in terms of security, Bitcoin's hash rate and simple base layer give it more assurances as a way to store value or transmit value than every other blockchain. When we look at scale, of course, Bitcoin's the largest protocol by market capitalization. It's also one of the largest protocols in terms of development network and how much value is transmitted in any given period of time. And then in terms of decentralization, basically there's more of a division of powers in the Bitcoin network compared to most other cryptocurrencies, even ones that are also pretty big on terms of scale. And so the next few slides will dive into these three individually with more detail. So if you focus on security, when it comes to a proof of work protocol, scale is a very big factor. And so, what this chart on the right shows is Bitcoin's hash rate. So it's a rough measure of how much processing power is used to secure the network, compared to some of its copies, like Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, that have, they've taken the blockchain, they've forked off, they've made their own changes. And so what we see is that Bitcoin has orders of magnitude more, security than those other offshoots. An analogy that I've seen used, for example, is that almost anyone, could copy and host Wikipedia, right? So Wikipedia is not that much data. You could copy it, you could put it on your own website. But what is the chance that you'd be able to actually get the traffic that Wikipedia has? And the chance, of course, is almost zero, because even though you could replicate, the current state of Wikipedia, you'd be unable to replicate the millions and millions of links around the world pointing to Wikipedia. You'd be unable to, capture a large percentage of the user base that continually updates Wikipedia to instead go and update your version, right? So basically, Wikipedia's network effect is so entrenched that merely copying it is insufficient to become an actual competitor to Wikipedia. And so the same applies to blockchains. You can copy a blockchain, you can make your own blockchain, But unless you reach that critical mass of millions and millions of users with a well-designed protocol and appropriate decentralization and high levels of security, the blockchain is not going to be effective. And so there's only a couple blockchains that have really kind of reached that critical mass, and among them, Bitcoin has very unique characteristics. And so there's a variety of reasons that basically Bitcoin is more secure than its competing protocols. And so the fact that it uses dedicated ASICs, for example, in its mining algorithm, means that not only do you have to pay for electricity in order to mine Bitcoin, you also need to actually acquire dedicated hardware. So unlike a GPU-based blockchain, you can't merely rent, say, cloud GPUs to attack the blockchain. You'd actually need to somehow acquire the majority of the over 51% of the dedicated mining hardware. And so overall, Bitcoin has had 13 years almost of uninterrupted uptime. And that's in large part based on the fact that it has a tighter and larger security network than every other blockchain out there. And what's often called a bug is actually a feature is the fact that Bitcoin is very simple, right? So many other blockchains try to do more on the base layer, whereas Bitcoin is purposely very simple on the base layer. That gives it fewer attack surfaces, that gives it fewer risks for bugs or unknown outcomes of different types of transactions. It's basically a very simple base layer, and then any additional complexity that the ecosystem might want can be built on top of it in additional layers or side chains, or there can be other blockchains for other purposes. But basically, Bitcoin itself is designed to do a small number of things very, very well. And, for 13 years, that's what it's done. And so generally when you hear about a blockchain that offers more capability on the base layer or that, has, more transaction throughput or whatever the case may be, it's always important to ask yourself, what are the trade-offs that that blockchain is making? Because you have to realize that Bitcoin, the limitations that it has are there for a reason. Those are a specific set of design choices to maximize certain areas over other areas. And so whenever those variables are tweaked by another blockchain, they're sacrificing some aspects generally related to security or decentralization in order to achieve more capability on the base layer. So next we'll take a look at scale. And so of course Bitcoin has the largest market capitalization with estimated to be well over 100 million users at this point. And that includes on-chain users as well as users on exchanges or other providers. And so if that number is correct, and many estimates have pointed in that direction, that means Bitcoin has so far reached a higher level of adoption than the internet did by this point in its life cycle. And so it's being adopted very quickly. It's the fastest asset to touch $1 trillion market capitalization. And then, when you include not only the base layer, but also additional layers like Lightning and Liquid, as well as various side chains or other things in the ecosystem, and then all the variety of apps and hardware devices that are either Bitcoin specific or Bitcoin first, kind of focused on Bitcoin. It has, one of the largest overall networks in the blockchain space. And again, the more development that goes on, the better and better the system gets, and the bigger that gap becomes compared to the other blockchains in the ecosystem. And so when we look at, for example, hardware wallets, so there's many hardware wallets that accept multiple different coins, but then there are also hardware wallets that are Bitcoin only, that only work with Bitcoin by design to enhance their security and be more specialized. And so what that ultimately means is that, for example, Bitcoin has a greater range of hardware selection than other coins in the space. And that also applies to there's a variety of apps that only work with Bitcoin. And so in many ways, Bitcoin's ecosystem overlaps with the broader crypto space, but also has a very own dedicated Bitcoin-focused part of its ecosystem. And so when you include all these different layers, Bitcoin's development network is very, very big. And an analogy I like to use that other great researchers in the space have used is that it's more like a protocol than anything else. And so, often people ask themselves, okay, when is Bitcoin going to be replaced by a better competitor? It operates in technology, and so naturally we have to look to see what's going to be better. Now, however, when you look at protocols in the technology realm, protocols tend to be very, very long lasting. And that's because they achieve a certain critical mass that, that acceptance is what makes them valuable. And so an example is TCP/IP. As I speak right now, I mean, that protocol is between 4 and 5 decades old, and it's still the backbone of the internet. And 20 years from now, it'll still be the backbone of the internet. And of course, the internet over time changes very rapidly, but that underlying foundation for how it works is actually rather static and rather consistent. And so Bitcoin, in many ways, is adopting that approach where the base layer is this, purposely simple, robust platform for storing and transmitting value. And then all these other complexities can be added to it on top of it or alongside of it in different ways. But that underlying foundation doesn't have to, nor should it, change rapidly. Another example would be, for example, USB. And so USB at this point is almost 25 years old, and it's gone through three major upgrades over that time that are generally backwards compatible or can be made backwards compatible with the prior versions to get faster over time. And so, for example, if you were to come along and say, I've made a better TCP/IP, basically a better way to run the internet, or I've made a slightly better USB, you have to ask yourself, what is the chance that your protocol could catch on when those other protocols already have billions of users? And so at that point, they're not even competing purely on technology. They're competing on the fact that they're already so widely accepted that it's very, very hard to displace them as long as they continue to be a good foundation for updating over time, which again is what Bitcoin has become. So lastly, we can focus on decentralization. And this is where, for example, it's useful to compare, say, Bitcoin and Ethereum, because Ethereum is the other blockchain in the space that does have a very large market capitalization and development network as well. So that's the other blockchain that has a large network effect. But that's where that similarity ends because they actually have very different qualities in many other areas. And one of them is decentralization. So on the right here, we see for Bitcoin and Ethereum as examples, we see how much total supply they have, and then also how much new supply is issued per year. And so with the chart of Bitcoin on top, for example, we see that its supply and its issuance rate is very algorithmic. So from inception, it had a certain pattern that it was going to do, and it's done that perfectly since inception. And that's because there's really it would take almost unanimous consensus by the Bitcoin community in order to change that outcome, right? So you would need node operators, you would need miners, and developers to basically all conspire to change Bitcoin's monetary policy. Whereas Ethereum, when we look at Ethereum at the bottom there, so Ethereum has a different design philosophy. So they use, for example, difficulty bombs on the blockchain in order to basically force a quicker update path than, say, Bitcoin has. And so what that essentially does is it gives the developers more influence over that network than developers have over the Bitcoin network. And so, for example, Ethereum's issuance rate has been more variable. The monetary policy is prone to changes. And depending on how you look at it, that could be considered a feature or a bug. Obviously, people in the community have different ways of looking at that. But the point is, those are two very different design philosophies. So one has been more prone to change, whereas one is more prone to basically, you have a very high probability of being able to understand Bitcoin's monetary policy looking out 5 or 10 years compared to a protocol like Ethereum. And so, when we look at this, when you look at a competing blockchain, whether it's Ethereum, whether it's one of the other protocols out there, you have to ask yourself between the nodes, the miners, and the developers, who has the primary amount of control. And so, for example, in Bitcoin, because nodes by design are easy for someone with a basic computer and a basic internet connection to run, that means there's a very, very large number of people that store the full node, and that therefore if miners conspire to change something about the blockchain, their ability to get past that full node network is limited, right? So the nodes essentially have a large degree of power in that network. Whereas when you look at other systems, other blockchains that, they make their base layer far more complex, it makes it very, very hard for users to run their own full node. And so that, basically centralizes power more in the hands of the miners or the developers, and it becomes a more company-like system rather than a protocol, a decentralized protocol. And so when we think about different types of blockchains, it's important to always be aware of the trade-offs and understand that part of what has made Bitcoin successful is that by keeping the base layer simple, by keeping the nodes small and easy to operate, it has achieved a level of decentralization that is very, very hard for other blockchains to replicate. Because all the features that they're adding are also adding complexity to that process of running your own full node. And so basically to summarize, we can compare Bitcoin to MySpace because that's an often way of thinking about it among investors that are maybe cautious about wondering if Bitcoin is going to be displaced or not. And so MySpace, of course, is a well-known example of a social media network. It launched shortly before Facebook, but it was eventually surpassed by Facebook, a later competitor. But there are some differences to be aware of. And so, for example, Bitcoin reached a $1 trillion market capitalization and continues to be the leading cryptocurrency almost 13 years into its existence, whereas MySpace reached a peak market capitalization of about 12 billion 5 years into its existence and then was surpassed and it quickly fell in market capitalization. And so, Bitcoin has already reached a level of scale and basically market dominance that is very different than MySpace reached and for a longer period of time. Another difference is that, Bitcoin came after Bitgold, Hashcash, and B-Money. So it's not the first one to do what it's done. It's just the first one that put enough pieces together in order to achieve the wide success that basically paved the way for all these other cryptocurrencies. And so it's not necessarily the first or oldest technology. It's actually, when it came, it was actually, relying on, at that point, decades of prior work. And then lastly, as we said before, Bitcoin is largely following the path of a protocol rather than a company, whereas many other blockchains in the space end up looking more like a company in the sense that they're still very reliant on their founders, still very reliant on a centralized development team, whereas Bitcoin at this point is more distributed. And so whereas MySpace, of course, as a company, it followed the path of company, it had an early management change early on. And for example, they were slow to adopt to the shifting user base towards mobile phones, and so that was a key reason why they eventually fell to later networks. Whereas Bitcoin continues to optimize exactly what it tries to optimize for. So basically, it's the fact that there's not that many features on the base layer is again by design, and so it's not being surpassed in terms of technology by other protocols. It's not being overcome by later developments because every one of those developments comes with trade-offs in a way that Bitcoin has, as that ecosystem has chosen not to adopt, at least not on the base layer, in order to ensure some of those prior attributes of security and decentralization. So basically, another way of looking at it is that part of Bitcoin's success, in addition to being a well-designed protocol, is the path dependence. It's very, very hard to replicate Bitcoin's unique path dependence at this point. And so what I mean by that is Bitcoin was made by a creator that was, eventually left the ecosystem. He remains unknown, or they. And whereas many other cryptocurrency projects they take more of the path of a company, where they generally have it's harder for them to achieve a level of decentralization, and it's harder for them to basically follow this very, very decentralized path that Bitcoin's gone through. It's very hard for them to distribute their coins in a fair way, and it's very hard for them to achieve the scale and the adoption that Bitcoin has. So as full disclosure, I am long Bitcoin. I own Bitcoin, and I also advise some Bitcoin companies. But one thing I like to point out is that my research company focuses on multiple asset classes, and so I'm not tied to any one asset, and I'm happy to look at multiple different asset classes, both outside of the cryptocurrency space and in the cryptocurrency space. And that's why in many ways I've continued to focus on Bitcoin in my view as the primary cryptocurrency that offers a lot of value and that is unlikely to be surpassed anytime soon by a technology superior blockchain. So thank you so much for listening in and have a great day.